Grace handed a steaming cup of coffee to the man with the turkey right there in front of the health inspector. Her boss didn't yell or scowl, just delivered the verdict with an icy finality. "You're done, Grace." 6 years of devotion to the Mason Mug Café wiped out in one blunt sentence. She didn't cry. Her hands trembled as she untied her apron, but she walked out with her head high, not because she'd broken some rule, but because she'd stood up for a veteran and his boyal service dog, Shadow. What Grace couldn't have known was that someone had caught the whole scene on their phone. By the time the morning rush died down, the ground was already rumbling. 4 military Humvees pulled into the parking lot, and out stepped a Marine colonel in crisp dress blues, a man who owed his life to the very kind of veterans Grace had defended. In that instant, everything shifted. At 35, Grace Donnelly wasn't the kind of woman who turned heads at first glance, but she lingered in people's memories. She ran the Mason Mug Café, a cozy spot perched on the edge of downtown Mason, Georgia, just a short drive from Fort Gringanger, one of the Southeast's biggest Marine bases. The town itself felt like a snapshot from a simpler time: oak-shaded sidewalks, American flags fluttering on porches, and a hardware store still sporting the same faded paint from the 1980s. But inside the cafe, the air was different, warmer, more alive. Grace made it that way. She didn't treat the place like a business. She treated it like a home, a haven where someone could walk in, weary from a long day or a longer deployment, and feel human again. The coffee was nothing fancy, no trendy lattes or frothy designs, just strong, hot, bottomless cups and a bulletin board plastered with handwritten notes. But the Mason mug wasn't about the coffee, it was about Grace. She remembered names, birthdays, and the dates deployments began or ended. She knew who liked their eggs cooked hard and who hadn't touched coffee since coming back from Iraq. She held space for silence, especially for the veterans who carried scars deeper than skin. Every Wednesday at 9 o'clock a.m., she hosted Heroes Hour, a quiet tradition that had taken root in Mason. It started small, just 3 regulars: her father-in-law, Ben Donnelly, a retired Marine Corps drill instructor; Ralph, a Vietnam vet who spoke little but showed up every week; and Louisa, a former Army nurse whose laugh rang like wind chimes. Over time, the group grew. Veterans from Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan, all drawn not by the menu, but by the woman who made the cafe a sanctuary. Grace always opened Heroes Hour with the same words: "This is a place to be seen, not fixed. To sit, not perform." The veterans would nod, their shoulders softening as they sipped coffee and shared stories. Some light, some heavy, some too raw for words. Grace kept her own story close to her chest, but the town knew the shape of it. Her husband, Staff Sergeant Michael Donnelly, had been killed in action 6 years earlier in Afghanistan's Helmand province. His photo hung above the register, not in his Marine uniform, but in jeans and a flannel, clutching a coffee mug outside the cafe. It was snapped 2 weeks before his last deployment. He never made it home. Grace never remarried, never even seemed to consider it. Instead, she poured her grief into the Mason mug, not to run from it, but to build something enduring. Grace Donnelly ran Mason Mug Café with a purpose that went beyond pouring coffee. It was a haven, a place where veterans found solace and locals felt a sense of home. Her quiet dedication earned her respect. Veterans called her ma'am with sincerity. Teenagers held the door without prompting, and even the mayor dropped by monthly to commend her for knitting the community together. For Grace, it wasn't about praise. It was about the unspoken mission. Every cup poured for a trembling vet. Every gentle check-in with someone lost in thought. Every service dog allowed to rest under a table without question. She didn't follow a manual. She followed her heart. That Wednesday morning started like any other. The bell above the door chimed softly as regulars shuffled in, the air rich with the scent of brewing coffee and the murmur of familiar voices. Laughter mingled with the clink of mugs, and the cafe hummed with warmth. Grace didn't know it yet, but by nightfall, her small corner of the world would spark a firestorm that would ripple far beyond the town, straight to Washington. It all began with a man, his dog, and a woman who wouldn't yield. The morning sun cast a crisp light, cooler than it felt, with steam curling from coffee cups like tiny spirits. Grace stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, greeting each familiar face with a nod that was both reserved and kind. She'd already brewed the dark roast for Heroes Hour, setting out the ceramic mugs reserved for the veterans. The door swung open again, and Ray McMillan stepped inside, Shadow at his side. Ray, a late 50s ex-Marine Corps recon veteran, was a man of few words. He didn't linger long, but his presence meant something. Shadow, his black lab German shepherd mix, stayed close, his red vest emblazoned with service dog, do not pet. Grace gave a small wave. Table by the window's open, she said with a smile. Ray nodded, muttered a thanks, and led Shadow to the far corner. Then the mood shifted. The door opened with a sharp gust, and a man in a navy blazer and pressed slacks strode in, his face devoid of warmth. He clutched a clipboard like it was a scepter. His name tag read Logan Prescott, State Health Inspector. Grace hadn't been expecting him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but steady. "Inspection," he replied curtly, unannounced. He moved through the tram with cold precision, tapping surfaces, checking labels, and opening fridge doors. Then he froze, his eyes locking on Shadow. "That animal," he declared, pointing, his voice cutting through the room, "is in violation of state health code. No animals allowed where food is served." The cafe fell silent. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Grace stepped from behind the counter, her voice calm but firm. "He's a registered service dog. Federal law permits him to be here." Prescott's frown deepened, his gaze sweeping the room as if searching for an ally. "I don't care about the vest," he said. Ray sat rigid, his knuckles white around the coffee mug, as if it might slip from his grasp. Shadow, his loyal black lab German shepherd mix, lay still at his feet, eyes fixed on his owner, waiting for a cue. The air in Mason Mug Café grew heavy, every sound swallowed by a tense silence. Grace Donnelly, the cafe's manager, drew a steady breath, her voice calm but unyielding. "I won't ask a veteran to leave, and I won't ask his service dog to go either. Write your report if you must, but know you're shaming a man who fought for this country in front of those he swore to protect." Logan Prescott, the state health inspector, stood with a tightened jaw, his clipboard practically trembling in his grip. "Animals carry dander, saliva, hair," he'd snapped moments earlier. "This is a health code violation. Get that dog out, or this place gets shut down." Now his eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, a murmur of agreement rippled through the cafe. "Damn right," someone whispered from a corner table. The moment was shattered by a new presence. Deborah Lyle, the regional manager for Mason Mug's parent company, stood in the doorway, her sharp gaze taking in the scene. She'd arrived early for a routine inspection, only to witness Grace's stand. Her voice cut through the room like a blade. "Grace Donnelly, you've just defied a direct health compliance order in front of a state inspector. Clear out your things. You're done." Gasps echoed. A spoon clattered to the floor. Ray half rose from his seat, stunned, while Grace stood rooted, her expression unreadable. Slowly her eyes swept the room, to Ray, to Shadow, to the chalkboard sign proclaiming, "Heroes Hour, free coffee for vets." A faint smile tugged at her lips. With trembling hands, she untied her apron, folded it neatly, and laid it on the counter. Turning to Lena, the young barista hovering by the espresso machine, she whispered, "Make sure Ray gets his refill." Then without another word, she stepped through the side door into the morning light, leaving the cafe frozen in her wake. No one followed her, but someone's phone was recording, capturing the quiet rebellion. Somewhere in the vast web of social media, a story was born, a woman fired not for breaking a rule, but for standing by her principles. Far away in an office lined with military photos and polished brass nameplates, Colonel Richard Gaines received a call that demanded his attention. For 35 minutes, the cafe was a tomb. Customers whispered among themselves, some abandoning half-finished drinks, others staring out the windows as if answers might drift in with the breeze. Lena stayed at her post, hands shaking as she poured Ray's second cup. "I didn't know what to say," she'd later confess, "but I knew if I left, I'd be letting Grace down." Ray hadn't touched his coffee since Grace's exit. Shadow remained curled at his feet, ears twitching, sensing the fracture in the room's energy. Then a low rumble stirred the air, faint at first, like thunder rolling over Georgia's hills. Chairs creaked, coffee cups rippled, and the cafe's windows hummed. Customers rose, peering outside. Through the morning mist and tree-lined sidewalks of Main Street, four military Humvees rolled into view, their tires growling against the pavement. Their lights pierced the haze like beacons. The vehicles lined up in the parking lot, deliberate and imposing, blocking the cafe's entrance. Doors swung open in unison, and out stepped Colonel Richard Gaines, his Marine Corps dress blues immaculate, gold buttons gleaming, white gloves tucked in hand. The air in Mason Mug Café grew heavy as Colonel Richard Gaines stepped through the door, his boots striking the floor with a deliberate, resonant thud. His uniform was crisp, adorned with a cascade of ribbons that spoke of battles fought and honors earned. Behind him, 24 Marines stood in perfect formation along the sidewalk, their presence a silent testament to something greater than the small cafe could contain. Inside, the usual hum of conversation stopped. Logan Prescott, the state health inspector, stood frozen by the pastry case, his clipboard dangling uselessly at his side. Deborah Lyle, the regional manager, paled, retreating from the counter as if it might scald her. The bell above the door gave a single sharp jingle as Colonel Gaines crossed the threshold alone. His gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on Lena, the young barista, who swallowed hard under the weight of his attention. Then his eyes found Ray McMillan, the ex-Marine with his service dog, Shadow, at his side. Ray rose slowly, his movements steady but cautious, their eyes locked, and a quiet nod passed between them, a wordless acknowledgement of shared history. The colonel raised a hand in a crisp salute, and Ray returned it, the moment thick with unspoken respect. Prescott stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know who he was. Colonel Gaines didn't raise his voice, but his words cut through the silence like a blade. You don't need to know someone's story to treat them like they matter. He turned to Lena. Is Grace Donnelly here? Lena shook her head, her voice small but clear. She was fired for standing up for Mr. McMillan and Shadow. The colonel's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger crossing his otherwise stoic face. Grace Donnelly gave more to the families of this base than most could ever claim. She built a haven for my men, a place where they could sit in peace when words failed them. And she showed a decorated Marine the respect this country owes him, a respect too many forget. Ray cleared his throat, his voice low but steady. She didn't ask me questions, didn't blink when I came in with Shadow. Just poured my coffee and gave me a place to feel human again. First time in years I felt like I belonged anywhere. A woman near the register wiped a tear from her cheek, her breath catching. Colonel Gaines nodded, his eyes moving to the Marines waiting outside. With a single deliberate gesture, he signaled them. They entered in silence, their steps measured and reverent. 2 Marines moved behind the counter, carefully removing the corporate logo from the wall, folding it with the precision of a flag at a military funeral. Another step forward, replacing the cafe's chalkboard sign with a new one, pulled from their vehicle. In bold, hand-painted white letters, it declared, "Welcome to Grace's house, where honor is served daily." Deborah Lake all opened her mouth to protest, but one look from the colonel silenced her. "You've made your choice," he said, his tone final. "Now we'll make ours." He stepped outside, pulling his phone from his pocket. Moments later, Lena's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, confusion creasing her brow. "It's a message from Fort Granger," she said. "They're asking for Grace to report to base headquarters. Today." Ray exhaled slowly, his eyes widening as Shadow rose to his feet. In the cafe that had once been a simple place for coffee and comfort, something new was stirring. A reckoning long overdue. Grace sat in her truck, parked at the edge of her driveway, the keys cold in her hand. The engine was off, but she hadn't moved in 15 minutes. Still dressed in her coffee-stained jeans, her favorite blue flannel, and shoes worn thin from countless spilled espressos, she stared at the road ahead. The morning replayed in her mind, fired in front of customers for doing what was right. Now, a message from Fort Granger. Colonel Gaines wanted to meet at headquarters. Today. She didn't know what it meant, or if it was good or bad. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of something, hope maybe, flickered. Grace sensed a change in the air. a shift that stretched beyond the familiar rhythm of her days at the Mason Mug Café. She took a deep breath, turned the key in the ignition, and steered her car down the well-worn road she'd traveled countless times. But this wasn't a routine trip to deliver pastries or coffee supplies. Today, she was headed somewhere different, through the towering gates of Fort Granger. The base sprawled before her, a maze of orderly streets and flag-lined paths, the faint rhythm of cadence calls drifting through the air. She'd been here before as a military spouse, but stepping into the main administration building now, she felt like a stranger in a familiar land. Colonel Richard Gaines was waiting at the entrance, his khaki uniform crisp but unpretentious, his presence steady enough to silence a room with a single look. "Grace," he greeted, offering a firm handshake. "Thanks for coming." She gripped his hand, her confidence tinged with uncertainty. "I'm still not sure why I'm here," she admitted. "Come with me," he said, motioning her forward. They walked down a corridor adorned with portraits of stern-faced commanders, detailed training maps, and polished plaques celebrating past achievements. They paused at a door marked Veteran Transition and Wellness Initiative. Inside, the room was a work in progress, folding chairs scattered about, whiteboards leaning against walls, and boxes of unused supplies stacked haphazardly. A handful of young staff members moved quietly in the corner, arranging therapy mats and sorting donated equipment. "This is a pilot program," Gaines explained, his voice steady. "We've been trying to get it off the ground for 2 years. The problem is finding someone who gets veterans, not just their paperwork, but their lives." Grace crossed her arms, skeptical. "I'm no therapist. I don't have a degree in social work." "No," Gaines agreed, "but you built something special at that cafe. You created a place where people with scars you can't see found a way to heal. You did more with coffee and kindness than some programs manage with millions." Grace didn't respond immediately, her mind turning over his words. Gaines stepped closer, his voice softening. "You made a sanctuary without even trying. What you did at the Mason Mug, that was leadership. That was service." A voice broke the moment from the back of the room. "Is that her?" A young woman in her mid-20s emerged, her long sleeves hiding burn scars that traced along her arms and jaw. Her name tag read Tiffany Rios. Beside her trotted a golden retriever puppy, its red vest proudly labeled "In Training." "Hi," Tiffany said, her voice shy but warm. "I saw that video of you with the citing on the guy. I haven't felt comfortable in a coffee shop since I got back, but I think I could sit in a place you run." Grace's breath caught, a quiet shift stirring in her chest. Gaines gave a small smile. "We want you to take charge of this center, Grace. Not as a figurehead, not as a name on a pamphlet, but as the director. You'd shape the programs, build the space, set the tone. You already know what works. Community, routine, respect." Grace's eyes drifted to Tiffany, who was now kneeling beside her puppy, gently stroking its fur. She thought of Ray and his dog Shadow, of the countless veterans who'd wandered into the Mason Mug, not for a latte, but for a moment of peace. In that instant, something clicked. "I'll do it," she said, her voice soft but certain. Gaines nodded once, a spark of approval in his eyes. "Then let's get to work." That night, Grace stood alone in the empty room that would soon become the heart of Fort Granger's outreach efforts. The walls were bare, the floors scuffed, but the space hummed with a quiet, sacred potential. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn photograph. It was Michael, her husband, sitting in his uniform, his smile as bright as the day they'd met. Grace Donnelly stood in the Veteran Transition and Wellness Center at Fort Granger, her gaze lingering on a faded photograph of her late husband Michael pinned to the wall. He was outside the Mason Mug Café, boots propped up, a rare grin lighting his face. No frame or plaque adorned it, just raw memory, a quiet anchor for her mission. Word of the center had spread like wildfire. By week's end, it was no longer just a military program. It pulsed with life. Veterans who hadn't set foot on the base in decades wandered in. Young soldiers arrived, their spouses trailing behind, unsure but curious. The Mason Herald splashed a full-page story, "From Coffee to Community, Grace Donnelly's Quiet Revolution." Grace didn't chase grandeur. No high-profile speakers or polished consultants graced her doors. She simply did what she always had. She noticed people. She learned their names, etched them in her mind. A whiteboard hung by the coffee pot, scribbled with, "Need a ride, need to talk." Dogs sprawled in therapy room corners, unquestioned. Her old cafe notebook, now thick with new pages, held a record for every veteran who crossed the threshold. Some days were still, others heavy with unspoken grief, and many were just refills and quiet. But something real was taking shape. A haven where wounds didn't need to hide and healing didn't demand noise. Ray McMillan was a regular now, his service dog shadow padding straight to a favorite corner, settling as if it were home. Tiffany Rios came every Tuesday, her burn scars a silent story. She wasn't ready for group talks, but her sketches of dogs, hands, reunions spoke volumes. Lena, the young barista from Mason Mug, swung by every Friday, bringing coffee and her infectious laugh. When Grace needed input on anything from paint colors to website copy, Lena's voice was the first she sought. Not everyone was on board. Some officials raised eyebrows, skeptical of a woman with no formal training leading a federal pilot program. Auditors slipped in, clipboards poised, their suits as stiff as their questions. They pored over logs, probed her methods, even inspected the coffee machine's water filters. At the end, one auditor fixed Grace with a hard stare. "What certifications qualify you to counsel veterans?" he asked. Grace met his gaze, unflinching. "None," she said, her voice steady. "Just showing up and caring." He said nothing, but his pen scratched furiously. A week later, a letter arrived. The center was under review for potential nationwide expansion. Colonel Gaines called it a triumph. Grace called it humbling. Still, the Mason Mug Café tugged at her heart. One afternoon, she slipped in unannounced. Lena, behind the counter, grinned. "Thought you were a big shot now," she teased, sliding a mug over. "Just here for the coffee," Grace replied, a smile tugging at her lips. The cafe had transformed. Photos of veterans, Ray, Tiffany, and others, now lined the walls. A new sign hung near the register, "Grace's Corner, where no one sits alone." Later that day, Grace drove to a small fundraiser for veteran families, a modest gathering of elderly folks and kids clutching crayon-drawn posters. She spoke without notes. "I didn't plan to start a movement," she said. "I just couldn't turn away a man and his dog." The room stilled, then erupted in applause, raw, heartfelt, and resounding. That evening at the Wellness Center, Grace sat alone by a wall adorned with photographs, each a snapshot of memory and meaning. She carefully pinned up a new one, a vibrant image of Mason Mug Café, captured the day after the Humvees rolled through town. The scene was alive with people standing close, shoulder to shoulder, service dogs resting beneath tables, coffee cups in every hand. There was no fear, no judgment, just a quiet sense of belonging. Above the photo, she taped a small card with words she'd written in careful script. "Legacy isn't what we build for ourselves. It's what we protect in others." In the stillness of that moment, Grace realized the cafe hadn't shuttered. It had simply found a new home in the hearts of those it served. 3 weeks after the fundraiser, a letter arrived, sealed in an envelope, bearing the gold-embossed seal of the Department of Defense. Colonel Richard Gaines delivered it to her himself, standing in her modest office at the Wellness Center, where the air hummed with the quiet promise of healing. "You'll want to sit for this," he said, his voice steady but warm. Grace's hands trembled as she opened the envelope, her eyes catching the first line through a haze of disbelief. "You are hereby nominated for the National Civilian Commendation for Distinguished Service to Veterans." She read it again, then once more, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't do anything extraordinary." Gaines let out a soft chuckle. "That's exactly why you're getting this." The letter came with an invitation, not just to attend a ceremony in Washington, D.C., but to speak at the National Veterans Advocacy Conference. Grace felt her knees buckle. "I'm no public speaker," she protested. "You are now," Gaines replied with a grin. When the day came to leave for D.C., she packed light, a single blazer, Michael's old watch, and the worn notebook she'd kept behind the cafe counter for years. Its pages held more than just orders. Names, birthdays, small notes like "Tiffany prefers tea" and "Don't ask Ray about May 15th. That notebook carried the weight of countless stories, more valuable than any resume. At the airport, as she stood waiting, a familiar voice called out, Need a ride, Miss Donnelly? She turned to see Ray McMillan, standing tall in his crisp dress blues, his silver star gleaming on his chest. Shadow, his black lab German shepherd mix, sat calmly at his side, tail gently sweeping the floor. The base assigned me as your escort, Ray said, a grin tugging at his lips. Grace laughed, a mix of nerves and amazement. You clean up pretty well, she teased. He smirked. You're the one about to address the Pentagon. The conference ballroom was grander than she'd imagined. White tablecloths, a polished brass podium, cameras capturing every angle. Her name glowed in elegant script on a screen behind her. When she stepped to the microphone, her voice felt small in the vast room, but the audience leaned in to listen. I'm not a general or a doctor. I didn't write laws. I ran a cafe near a military base. I poured coffee. I listened. She paused, steadying herself. But in that space, I saw something sacred unfold. Veterans didn't come for advice. They came for presence. They didn't need fixing. They needed to be seen. Heads nodded in the crowd. A few hands brushed away tears. One day I was fired for letting a man sit with his service dog. That's when everything changed. But the truth is, it was never about the coffee. It was about dignity. The room erupted in applause, the sound rolling through the hall like thunder. In the back, Ray stood quietly, not clapping, not cheering, just nodding, as if her words had finally clarified a mission he'd long carried. Later that night, as the sun sank behind the Potomac, Grace stepped outside for a moment of solitude, craving the quiet of open air. A man approached, his gray suit sharp but his presence gentle, a white beard framing kind eyes behind thin glasses. You don't remember me, do you? He asked softly. She gazed at his weathered face, a spark of recognition flickering within her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, faded photograph. It showed her late husband, Michael, standing beside an older man in a crisp military uniform, both outside the Mason Mug Café, years before Michael's final tour in Afghanistan. You poured me coffee the day I got my medical discharge, the man said softly. No words, just a smile. It was the first time I felt human again. He extended the photo toward her. This belongs to you now. Her hands trembled as she took it, her voice trapped in her chest. Back in Mason, the town buzzed with a homecoming celebration, but Grace didn't head there right away. Instead, she drove to the wellness center. The night was still, the air quiet except for the soft crackle of a fire pit where a few veterans lingered. She approached the wall adorned with photographs, reached into her bag, and pinned up a new one, a snapshot of a conference crowd rising to their feet in applause for her. Next to it, she carefully taped the old photo of Michael and the soldier from years past. Beneath them, she scrawled a simple truth: honor blooms where kindness never wavers. As she turned to leave, a young veteran with hesitant eyes stepped through the doorway. Is this the place for people like us? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace's smile was warm, steady. No, son, this is a place for all of us. In that moment, her world didn't just feel complete, it felt boundless. In a world that races forward, it's easy to miss the quiet moments, the gentle presence of a waitress, the trembling courage of a veteran, the loyal wag of a service dog's tail. But those moments, small as they seem, can shape lives. Grace Donnelly never wore a uniform or held a title, but she carried something sacred: dignity. Through her actions, she showed that honor isn't a one-time act, it's a daily commitment. What unfolded in that little cafe in Mason, Georgia, might feel like a rare tale, but perhaps it shouldn't be. How many graces do we pass by without seeing? How many veterans do we honor with words but not deeds? In a fractured world, Grace's story calls us to pause, to reflect, to ask, would I have stood as she did?